I had exactly $184,600 tied up in an escrow dispute, a concussion I still hadn't fully recovered from, and a padded manila envelope sitting on the passenger seat beside me when my sister-in-law leaned across a linen-covered table and told my daughter, "Sweetheart, family photos are for actual family." I remember touching the wrong turn signal at the light because my left hand still went numb when I got tired. That was 6 weeks after my wife died, for days before the probate hearing, and 2 hours before I learned the resort where I had paid for everyone's rooms had quietly moved me and my child out of the main villa. The envelope contained a notarized statement, 3 property schedules, and a USB drive my late wife had labeled in black marker with one word, later. By midnight, there would be an emergency filing, a venue manager in tears, and one sentence from a probate judge that changed everything. Let me take you back. My name is Daniel Mercer. I was 41 then, a commercial architect in Savannah, Georgia, the kind of man people hired when they wanted a boutique hotel or a church renovation to look effortless from the outside and survive a hurricane on the inside. I had always been good at systems, load paths, hidden weaknesses, less good at the soft failures that happened inside families. My flaw, if I'm honest, was that I could outwork any problem and convince myself effort was the same thing as truth. My wife, Elise, had died in a freeway pileup 49 days earlier on Interstate 16, coming back from a donor luncheon she almost hadn't attended. She was 38, a museum development director, disciplined, warm, and much more perceptive than I gave her credit for while she was alive. The concussion came from the same week, from a scaffolding slip on a site I should not have been visiting in that condition. Grief had made me careless. My daughter Ren was 8 years old and had developed the quiet, over-careful politeness children sometimes build when they feel the adults around them are balancing glass. The public event was supposed to be a memorial gala in Charleston, South Carolina, at a coastal resort Elise's family used whenever they wanted to perform generosity in front of donors. It was framed as a scholarship fundraiser in Elise's name. Her mother, Patrice Holloway, had announced it like an act of love. "We'll celebrate Elise properly," she had told everyone, "with dignity." My brother-in-law Grant handled the family foundation. His wife Felicity handled appearances. Between the two of them, they could turn grief into branding faster than most people could sign the guest book. The clock started 3 days before the gala, when a probate attorney named Miriam Sloan called me at 7:12 in the morning. She said, "Mr. Mercer, I need you in my office by noon." I asked, "Is something wrong?" She paused just long enough for me to understand the answer before she spoke it. Then she said, "If you miss this, you lose everything." I got there with sight dust still on my shoes and a splitting ache behind my left eye. Miriam was one of those lawyers who looked almost delicate until she started speaking. Then everything sharpened. She slid a document across the desk. It was a petition challenging my authority as surviving spouse and co-trustee. Grant had filed it through a family-connected firm in Charleston. Their claim was that Elise had intended most of her separate assets, including a commercial property LLC and a donor-advised scholarship fund, to remain under bloodline stewardship through the Holloway Foundation. I stared at the page and said, "Bloodline stewardship isn't legal language." Miriam said, "No, but they wrapped it in allegations about incapacity, undue influence, and asset preservation." I laughed once because sometimes the body reaches for the wrong tool. "Incapacity," I said. "Elise was working until the day she died." Miriam tapped a paragraph. "They're implying you handled too much of the household, too much of her travel, too much of her financial admin after her migraines worsened last year. They want the court to believe she relied on you so heavily that key transfers deserve review." My wife trusted me. "They are betting grief makes people sloppy," she said, "and they are betting you won't want a public fight before the gala." I looked at the petition again. There were references to an irrevocable trust, to fiduciary duty, to an emergency temporary restraining order over distributions pending review. Nothing fatal by itself. Together, dangerous. Then Miriam set the padded envelope on the table. She said, "This arrived by courier an hour ago. No return name. It's addressed to you." Inside was a notarized affidavit from Elise's longtime executive assistant, a schedule of LLC ownership interests I had never seen, and a note in Elise's handwriting torn from one of her yellow legal pads. "Danny, if this reaches you before Miriam explains it, good. Listen to her. And if Patrice smiles too early, don't trust the room. Underneath that note was a line in smaller writing. Check the second folder. That was the first time I saw the USB drive labeled later. The history that led there had been building for years, though at the time I treated each incident like weather instead of climate. The first scar came at our wedding reception 9 years earlier. Patrice gave a toast at a historic inn in Savannah and spent 4 straight minutes praising Grant for keeping the family name anchored. Then she turned to me and said, smiling, "Daniel builds beautiful things. It's reassuring when useful men marry into old families." People laughed because she delivered cruelty in a tone usually reserved for compliments. Elise squeezed my hand under the table so hard it hurt. In the car, she cried and apologized. The next morning, Patrice sent orchids and acted as if apologies were for people with less money. The second scar came when Ren was 3. We had Thanksgiving at Patrice's house in Hilton Head. All the grandchildren's names were embroidered on stockings over the fireplace except Ren's. Felicity noticed first and said, too casually, "Oh, I thought Patrice was waiting until lineage was sorted on the formal tree." Ren was too young to understand, but Elise did. I did too. Patrice looked at the mantle and said, "Don't be dramatic." There wasn't enough time. Then she handed Ren a paper place card at the children's table in the breakfast room while Grant's boys sat in the dining room with the adults. Elise wanted to leave. I talked her into staying because her father, Arthur, had recently had bypass surgery, and I didn't want to ruin the holiday. That sentence still embarrasses me. I didn't ruin anything. I accommodated it. Patrice's family had a way of dehumanizing you with administration. They did not slam doors. They changed seating charts. They misunderstood emails. They reassigned hotel rooms. They referred to money as stewardship whenever they wanted control to sound noble. When I got home from Miriam's office that day, I plugged in the USB while Ren colored at the kitchen island. There were 2 folders. The first was labeled Foundation. The second was labeled If Needed. The second folder changed everything. It contained scanned emails, metadata exports, and a recorded voice memo from Elise, dated 11 days before she died. There were exchanges between Grant and a consultant about moving donor funds through a shell LLC tied to one of Felicity's event vendors. There were line items that looked like donor hospitality but mapped to private renovations on Grant's lake house. There were draft amendments to the scholarship fund that would have redirected control away from me as surviving spouse and eventually away from Ren if certain family continuity conditions were not met. Buried deeper was the real poison. Correspondence between Patrice and a board member suggesting Ren should be treated as a beneficiary only through discretionary distributions because Daniel's branch has no durable connection to the Holloway legacy unless remarriage is avoided. Unless remarriage is avoided. I sat very still in my chair while the room seemed to narrow. Elise had found this. Elise had organized it. And Elise had sent it toward me without telling me outright, which meant she had likely been buying time. There was also a 1-minute audio memo. Her voice came through tired, controlled. "Danny, if Miriam is with you, listen first and then breathe. I didn't tell you because I needed clean records before anyone panicked. Grant is moving foundation money. Patrice knows enough to be dangerous. Arthur suspects, but he's been ill and keeps choosing peace. The canary clause in the Harbor Lantern property matters. Do not let them corner you into signing anything at the gala." I replayed that twice. A canary clause is the kind of detail most people never hear about unless money and distrust have lived in the same document for years. Miriam explained it that afternoon. The Harbor Lantern property was a restored carriage house in Charleston that Elise had inherited a minority interest in through an LLC connected to her grandmother's estate. Hidden in the operating agreement was a fraud carve-out provision, a canary clause, Miriam called it informally, that triggered an automatic review and temporary transfer suspension if any managing member used affiliated vendors to divert charitable or trust-linked funds for private benefit. Elise had helped draft donor compliance language years earlier. She had built herself a trapdoor. Miriam looked at the records and said, "This isn't revenge. This is justice." I put the phone face down. Then I waited. Grant escalated before I did. That evening he called, sounding almost bored. "Daniel," he said, "I hear you've lawyered up. You filed first. We're trying to prevent confusion around Elise's intentions." Her intentions? A pause. Then he said, "You know how these things look. Widower, concussion, rapid asset movement, a child's future at stake. Patrice thinks it would be cleaner if we handled the foundation-linked items internally. Internally? Yes. Quietly. I said, quietly for whom? His voice lost one layer of polish. Don't be difficult before Saturday. I knew then the gala mattered for more than appearances. Donors would be there. A retired judge who sat on the museum board would be there. Arthur's pastor would be there. 2 members of the foundation's oversight committee would be there. Grant needed public serenity long enough to consolidate the narrative and maybe get me to sign a temporary management consent under pressure. That was uniqueness seed number 1 in the living plot, though I didn't think of it that way then. The social twist was that the room he meant to control would be full of exactly the people he could not afford to embarrass. The second twist came from an ally I had underestimated for years. Arthur called at 9:40 p.m. He said, "Do not discuss this on the phone." Then, after a silence heavy with effort, "Your room assignment at the resort has been changed. Check in anyway. Ask for Ms. Alvarez." I said, "Did Elise talk to you?" "Not enough," he said. "That is on me." Saturday arrived under a hard coastal rain. The storm had rolled in off the Atlantic early, pounding the bridges and knocking out power along parts of the peninsula. Half the floral installation for the gala had to be moved inside. Valets were drenched. Guests arrived irritable, expensive, and late. That was uniqueness seed number 2, the location twist. The storm didn't create the betrayal, but it stripped the event of its choreography. Ren wore a navy dress Elise had bought for a school recital and then never got to see her wear. When we reached the resort, the desk clerk looked down, then up, then too carefully neutral. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Mercer. There was a last-minute adjustment." "Adjustment to what?" "Your suite was reassigned. We have you in the carriage annex." The carriage annex was on the far edge of the property, near the service drive. I said, "Who authorized that?" She glanced toward a woman in a black blazer at the end of the counter. "Arthur had told me to ask for Ms. Alvarez." I did. Ms. Alvarez came over, took one look at my face, and said, "Please give me a moment." 10 minutes later, we were back in the main villa in the original suite Elise and I had reserved months earlier. Ms. Alvarez lowered her voice and said, "There have been multiple attempted changes to guest placement and access credentials. I restored the original event contract based on your payment records and legal status. I also copied the revision log." That was uniqueness seed number 3, the ally identity twist. The venue manager wasn't just helpful. She had become a witness. She handed me a printed revision history showing that Felicity had tried to move me and Rin twice and remove my signer privileges from the private donor lounge. Timestamps, user IDs, IP origin notes. Metadata. Clean, boring, devastating metadata. At the pre-reception cocktail hour, the room was full of cream drapery, wet umbrellas, and people performing grief at fundraiser volume. Arthur looked worn down to his bones. Patrice looked immaculate in charcoal silk, like a widow in a play she had funded herself. Grant moved from donor to donor with a hand on each elbow. Felicity had the bright-eyed, over-pleasant look of someone holding a room together with lies and teeth. Rin stayed close to me until one of Elisa's old colleagues from the museum came over. She knelt and said, "Your mother once yelled at a trustee for trying to cut free student tickets. She did it with perfect grammar." Rin smiled for the first time that evening. Then Patrice crossed the room and said, "There she is." She bent toward Rin but kissed the air near her cheek instead of touching her. "What a brave little thing," she said. "Children here tone more than words." Ren's shoulders tightened. Patrice turned to me. "We've arranged family seating near the front for tonight's tribute." Felicity thought Ren might be more comfortable with the youth activities after dessert. "There are youth activities at a memorial gala?" "A quiet room upstairs. Crafts. A sitter. Ren stays with me." Patrice smiled. "Daniel, don't make administration emotional." I said, "You mistake me for someone asking." She held my gaze one beat too long. That told me she still thought the pressure would work. An hour later, Grant approached with a leather folder. "Just so nothing disrupts the scholarship announcement," he said, "we drafted a temporary management authorization. Standard language. Keeps distribution authority with the foundation for 90 days while probate settles." He opened it toward me. I read the first page. It was not standard. It would have effectively ceded operational control over 2 linked LLC interests and postponed my challenge rights. I handed it back. "No." Grant's jaw moved once. Think carefully. I did. If you miss this, he said quietly, you lose everything. He meant the room, the narrative, maybe Elisa's public image. He did not understand that someone had already used that line on me, and the threat no longer worked. Dinner began under lowered chandeliers because the storm kept flickering the lights. Arthur was placed center table, Patrice at his right, Grant and Felicity nearby. There was an open seat between me and the museum board chair, which surprised me until I realized Felicity had been overruled somewhere in the chain. Ren's place card, however, was not beside mine. It was at a small half-moon table off to the side with two cousins, a nanny, and a pillar cutting off the stage view. I held the card in my hand and felt something settle inside me. I walked to Felicity first because she was the logistician. Why is my daughter over there? She lowered her voice. Daniel, there are sightline issues and age grouping. Try again. Patrice answered from 2 seats away. The children don't need to be at the center of every solemn moment. Ren stood beside me, listening. Then Felicity made the mistake none of them could recover from. She gave Ren a bright event smile and said, Honey, this part is more for immediate family. Ren looked up at me and asked, very softly, I'm not. The room did not go silent all at once. It took a second. A fork set down. A chair shifted. A donor turned. I crouched to Ren's level. You are with me, I said. Always. I moved her place card next to mine and handed the side table card to a passing server. Please remove this. Patrice stood. Daniel, not now. No, I said. Now. I stayed standing. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. Before we begin, I said, I need to correct 2 administrative errors. You could feel the room lean in. The first is simple. My daughter was nearly seated out of view at her own mother's memorial because certain people in this family remain confused about what belonging means. Felicity turned pink. Grant half rose, then sat when he saw who was watching. The pastor, the retired judge, the museum board chair, and 2 donors whose names were on the scholarship brochure. I continued. The second error is more expensive. Grant said, Daniel. I took the printed revision log from my jacket and laid it beside Arthur's plate. These are the venue access changes made without my authorization, despite my payment of the event contract and my standing as surviving spouse. Arthur put on his glasses. Patrice said, too quickly. There must be some misunderstanding. I set down the next document. These are affiliated vendor payments from the Holloway Foundation routed through Crescent Turn LLC and then billed as donor hospitality while funding private residential improvements. Grant's face altered in a way I had never seen before. Not outrage. Calculation under impact. The museum board chair said, Grant, what is he referring to? Grant smiled, but it had gone thin. A grieving man misunderstanding accounting categories. I took out the USB drive. This contains the metadata chain, invoices, and a preliminary forensic audit memo. Copies are already with counsel. That got the first real silence. Felicity whispered, Daniel, don't do this here. I said, you moved a child. It sounds small when you say it plainly. That's why people get away with it. It's never just a seat. Arthur's hand was shaking as he lifted the revision log. Patrice, he said, did you authorize any room changes? Patrice didn't answer him. She looked at me. You are trying to ruin Elisa's evening. My wife is dead, I said. This is not her evening. This is your stage, and it's closing. The dramatic irony in that moment belonged to Grant. He still thought the worst risk was donor embarrassment. He had not yet realized the Harbor Lantern Canary clause had already been triggered an hour earlier. Miriam had filed the emergency notice at 5:14 p.m., attaching enough of the forensic memo to request a temporary asset freeze over foundation link transfers touching the LLC network. If the judge on call accepted the filing, no one at that table would be able to quietly move money by Monday. Grant reached for Arthur's papers. Arthur slapped his hand away with a speed that shocked everyone. Then the ballroom doors opened, and Miriam stepped in with a rain-damp coat over her arm and a process server behind her. There are moments in life that feel written, even when you know perfectly well they are just procedure arriving on time. Miriam said, Mr. Mercer. Every face turned. She walked to me, then to Arthur. Sir, I'm sorry for the setting, but given the pending hearing and the attempted document presentation tonight, service could not wait. Grant stood so fast his chair tipped. Attempted what? Miriam held up the folder Grant had tried to get me to sign. We obtained a draft from an event staffer asked to place this at Mr. Mercer's seat. It misstates fiduciary control and omits the fraud review trigger under the Harbor Lantern LLC operating agreement. The retired judge at Table 3 said, quite audibly, "Good God." Grant lunged for composure. "This is outrageous. Patrice, say something." Patrice looked at Arthur instead. That told me all I needed to know. When true pressure comes, people reveal their actual hierarchy. Arthur opened the folder. He read 2 paragraphs and sat down like his knees no longer trusted him. He said, "Did you think I would let you use her memorial for this?" Patrice whispered, "Arthur, no, just that one word. Not loud. Final." Miriam handed copies to Grant and Patrice. "For clarity," she said, "the court has been notified of potential self-dealing, disputed authority transfers, and attempted coercive execution of governance documents in a public setting." Grant said, "There is no court order." Miriam checked her phone. Then she said, "There is now." I still remember the vibration on the table from my own phone a second later. Temporary restraining order granted pending hearing. Freeze on specified transfers and changes of control. Preserve records immediately. The courtroom went silent 2 days later, but in that ballroom the silence began there. Grant read the notice and went white around the mouth. Felicity sat down hard. Patrice looked almost offended, as if law itself had breached etiquette. Arthur asked for the microphone that had been set for donor remarks. Nobody moved at first. Then the audio tech, poor man, brought it over with both hands. Arthur stood at the head table and said, "The scholarship announcement is postponed. There will be an independent audit of the foundation and all related entities. No donations are to be processed tonight." Gasps. Murmurs. A camera lowered. A donor couple quietly put their checkbook back in a purse. Patrice said, "Arthur, please think about appearances." He turned toward her with more age and more anger than I had ever seen in him. "I am," he said, "for the first time." Grant tried one last angle. He looked at me and said, "This is revenge because of a seating issue." I answered him in the same calm tone I use when telling a contractor a beam is failing. "No, the seating issue is how I know you believed I would stay quiet." I put the phone face down. Then I waited. The official consequence phase moved faster than Grant expected and slower than I wanted, which is usually how real justice works. At the Monday hearing in probate court, Miriam laid out the chain plainly. She explained the fiduciary obligations tied to the scholarship fund, the Shell LLC vendor route, the metadata from the resort revisions, the attempted management authorization, and the canary clause in the Harbor Lantern operating agreement. An expert from the forensic accounting firm testified to suspicious transfers and inadequate supporting documentation. Ms. Alvarez from the resort appeared by affidavit first, then later in person when Grant's attorney unwisely suggested the room changes were merely hospitality confusion. She brought the revision logs, time-stamped and linked to Felicity's login credentials. Metadata can feel almost impolite in court. It leaves so little room for personality. Grant's attorney argued there had been no completed misappropriation proven yet, only irregularities. Miriam responded that the standard for interim restraint was risk plus evidence, not a full merits finding. She was right. The judge agreed. "The record supports temporary preservation measures," the judge said, "and the child should not be collateral to family governance disputes." That line mattered to me more than the rest. The court extended the asset freeze, appointed a neutral fiduciary monitor over the scholarship-linked entities, and barred any amendment or transfer of control pending final review. When Grant interrupted to accuse me of exploiting grief, the judge looked over her glasses and said, "Mr. Holloway, grief did not generate metadata." The courtroom went silent. Patrice's lawyer later tried a softer strategy: settlement overtures, mutual non-disparagement, quiet restructuring, offers wrapped in concern. I declined all of it unless the terms included Wren's beneficiary protections, independent oversight, and formal removal of Grant from any position touching the scholarship fund. By then another board member had come forward, followed by a vendor who did not appreciate being listed on work they never performed. The shell arrangement unraveled the way bad drywall does once one clean seam opens. Arthur did something that surprised me. He cooperated fully. Not nobly at first. More like a man realizing denial had become expensive enough to offend his last working principle. But he did it. He signed the board resolutions. He consented to the neutral review. He amended his estate plan with explicit equal treatment provisions for all grandchildren through a professionally administered trust structure no one in the family could bend with manners and pressure. He also inserted a fraud disinherit clause for any beneficiary or fiduciary found to have intentionally diverted charitable or trust assets. Real law. Plain consequences. Grant resigned before he was formally removed. 2 months later, the civil review turned criminal in part when investigators found altered invoices and false certifications tied to donor reporting. Felicity was not charged, but her event firm lost every foundation contract it had. Patrice was forced off the board and prohibited from serving in any fiduciary capacity related to the scholarship entities. There was no dramatic handcuff scene, just resolutions, filings, reputational collapse, and a house growing quieter as invitations stopped arriving. As for Wren, the damage was more ordinary and therefore harder. For months, she asked logistical questions that were really moral ones. Did Grandma not like where I was sitting? Why did Aunt Felicity say immediate family? Did I make Mom sad by being there? Children do not experience betrayal as theory. They pin it to themselves unless you stop them. So I kept telling the truth in sizes she could carry. No. Adults were protecting their own feelings badly. No, belonging is not assigned by place cards. No, your mother loved you. Other people used that room for the wrong reason. My marriage, obviously, did not survive because there was no marriage left to preserve. Elise had not betrayed me. She had tried, in the final season of her life, to prepare a bridge out. What failed was my illusion that patience alone keeps bad systems from turning on children. 1 year later, Wren and I lived in a smaller house outside Savannah with a wide front porch and a kitchen table big enough that no one ever sat at the edge unless they wanted to. I had cut back on hospitality projects and taken more civic work, libraries, schools, adaptive renovations. Buildings for people who used them, not people who staged themselves inside them. Wren was 9 and played violin badly, but with conviction. She had also developed a habit of setting an extra place for whoever got moved last time, which started as a joke between us and became, quietly, our rule. Nobody in our home was ever buffered, tucked away, or administratively demoted. Arthur visited sometimes alone. He brought old maps for Wren because Elise had loved them. He never once asked for forgiveness in those visits, which made them easier to bear. He simply showed up, sat where he was offered, and listened. That counts for more than speeches. Grant ended up taking a plea on reduced fraud-related charges after the charitable reporting issues widened into other transactions. No prison epic, no cinematic ruin, just supervised release, restitution, and the specific humiliation of a man who had always mistaken inheritance for intelligence now having to ask permission to travel. Felicity moved to Atlanta and rebranded her firm around intentional gatherings, which I suppose is one way to survive public records. Patrice kept her house and her silver and, from what I heard, her certainty that she had been wronged by everyone except herself. Some people age into wisdom. Others age into polish. Every now and then, Wren still circles back. A few months ago, while helping me rinse dishes, she asked, "Was I immediate family?" I dried my hands and looked right at her. "You were the center of it," I said. "That's what scared them." She considered that with the seriousness children reserve for truths they will test again later. Then she said, "Good." And I laughed. That is the thing I learned. Boundaries are not dramatic when they are healthy. They are quiet. They look like corrected paperwork, canceled access, changed locks, neutral fiduciaries, and a parent moving a place card without asking permission. They look like not negotiating with people who need your silence more than your love. I used to think being the stable one meant absorbing impact, so everyone else could keep functioning. I was wrong. Sometimes stability means ending the pattern that feeds on your restraint. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do for a child is let a polished room become uncomfortable. If you've ever had to choose between keeping peace and protecting your own, you already know which one costs more. Tell me, what would you have done when the place card was in your hand? And if you want more stories where the receipts matter, stay with me.